Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This lecture is on surah Baqarah, verses 14 through 16. And I'll read the verses in Arabic and English and then make some comments. وَإِذَا لَقُوا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قَالُوا آمَنَّا وَإِذَا خَلَّا إِلَّا شَيَاطِينِهِمْ قَالُوا إِنَّا مَعَكُمْ إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُسْتَهْزِئُونَ. And when they meet those who believe, they say, "We believe." But when they are alone with their shayateen, their satans, their evil ones, they say, "Indeed, we are with you, only we are mockers." Allahu yastahzi'u bihim wa yamuduhum fi tughyanihim yamahun. Allah, God, mocks at them and prolongs them in their transgression. They wander blindly. Ulaika aladina ishtarawu al-dwalalat bilhud fama rabihat tijaratuhum wa ma kanu mutadin. Those are the ones who bought wandering with guidance, or exchanged wandering for guidance. So not profited their commerce, and not were they guided ones. So this is coming in the middle of a passage that we discussed before that begins in verse 6, talking about the kafirin. And these people are described as hypocrites, those who say that they believe, but they do not really believe. And in verse 14, it's saying specifically that they say we believe when it benefits them to do so, namely when they are with people who are sincere believers. So in order to please those people, in order to fit in with those people, they say we believe. But when those people are gone and when they're alone with their shaitans, with their satans, we'll have to talk about who that might be, they say, "Indeed, we are with you. We're actually on your side. We're only pretending. We're only mockers. We're mocking the believers." So I talked last time about how, from a historical perspective, according to Ishra Ahmed, at the time that the Qur'an was revealed, there was naturally a split in the community of Arabs who heard the message, that some were ready to die for that message and believed in it, and others were ready to die fighting it. And then in between were these people who wanted to benefit from this new trend, as long as it didn't entail any sacrifices for themselves. So hence the kind of double dealing here. But obviously there's always a broader sense than just the historical meaning of the verse. So more broadly, we can apply this to any situation in which someone in their private moments or with a private circle of friends behaves differently, speaks differently than when in some public setting. And I think what's interesting is the potential ambiguity of the word shayatinihim, their evil ones or their satans. Obviously, shaitan is the Arabic form of Satan. Because as we know from reading other passages in the Quran, shaitan is a very kind of fluid concept. On the one hand, shaitan is Iblis, the jinn, the very high-ranking jinn who is with the angels when God commands all of the angels to prostrate to mankind, to Adam. And he, of course, refuses and hence becomes shaitan becomes al-rajim, which is usually translated the rejected one, the cursed, but can also be translated as the conjecturer, the one who guesses at the truth. But more broadly, of course, I mean, even as the fact that that doubleness there even indicates this, right? That Iblis is both Iblis, a jinn, and shaitan, this more fluid identity. And so, in the plurality, the fact that shaitan is used in the plural form as shayatin, I think is the plural, and here it's shayatinahim, so they're Satans, still plural. That plurality indicates that it's not just one person or entity that is shaitan, but rather a kind of shape-shifting property or function which any number of individuals can sort of be the embodiment of. In this case, when it says that it's when the disbelievers are alone with their with their Satans, that could mean other people, but it could also mean something more sort of more invisible, right? It could mean they're just alone, entirely alone. There's no one else there, but they are sort of communing with whatever things inside of themselves are evil. So I think taken more imaginatively, this verse is talking about the conflict between our public and not just public, but even private professions of belief, our statements, our official stance that, I'm a Muslim, I believe in this, etc. And on the other hand, are the reality of what's going on inside of our hearts and minds at any given moment, which may not be as pretty as we'd like to think. So, and there's the indication, though, is that is not entirely involuntary on our part, that split is something that is actually deliberate. Now, of course, I'm interpreting this all on the premise that these verses can apply as much to ourselves as to some imagined other, some bad guys that are, we like to think that these verses are just about bad people that do bad things, but I don't see why God would even reveal these verses, have us read these verses and recite these verses, if they were not potentially at least alerting us to some problem, some flaw within ourselves. So that's the understanding, the premise on which I'm interpreting these verses. So taken in that light, again, I think it's inviting us to consider whether our belief is sincere. And what I began to say, I interrupted myself, but I was going to say that there's a element of a voluntary element even in our very insincerity, because what God is saying here is that it's not just that unbeknownst to ourselves in our private heart of hearts there's some doubt or there's some unwillingness to give everything to God. It's saying, when it suits me, I say I believe, but then when I think I'm kind of safe, I'm going to actually kind of take refuge in this darker part of my mind and spirit that tells itself, God's not listening now, no one's watching now. Secretly, I'm just doing this for whatever reason. I'm just kind of pretending. And my real self is satanic, I mean, it's hard to imagine oneself actually consciously doing that. But I think that, like so many verses of the Qur'an, this one's challenging us to think more imaginatively and realize that that our consciousness is much more complicated than we are aware, right? And that there might be a part of ourselves that we're not aware of, but which is nevertheless deliberately kind of duping ourselves into thinking that, yes, we're believers, we're sincere believers, but then reserving a part of our minds that's really not at all believing, that's not really committed at all to everything God asks of us. That's anyway one interpretation, one shot at understanding this verse. Okay, the next verse immediately picks up where the last one left off. It says, God mocks at them. So those who are mocking at God, well, they're actually being mocked by God. In fact, their very mockery of God is part of course, God is aware of, and that's backfiring on them, such that God can be said to actually be mocking them precisely as they are mocking God and mocking believers. And he prolongs them in their transgression. They wander blindly. So this, of course, is elaborating on verses 6 and 7 that say that God seals over. This is actually verse 7. God has sealed over their hearts and their hearing and over their vision as a covering. So the fact that these people are so lost that they're mocking at God, that they're pretending to be believers when they're secretly not, this is actually part of God's mockery of them and part of his punishment of them. So these verses, of course, leave no question, no doubt as to who is really in control, who is really the successful one, who is really the wise one. And, perhaps we shouldn't need such reminders, but I guess we do. I mean, we obviously live in a world where the successful, at least on a superficial level, the successful tend to be those who mock at God. And so for those of us, I suppose we all do, who need a reminder, these verses are telling us again and again, those who are mocking at God are actually being mocked. And the very fact that God is allowing them to continue to mock at him, continue to wander blindly, that is part of his mockery and it's part of his punishment. Okay, and then verse 16 I discussed in the previous lecture a little, and I'll add a little more, but I think it's a very important verse. So it says, those are the ones who bought wandering with guidance. And that's a literal translation. It's usually translated more as they exchanged wandering for guidance, and which is fine as well. But the reason I like the literal translation, they bought wandering with guidance, is it reminds us that the cost of wandering, the wandering is something that's valuable, not in a final sense, but it has an attraction for these people and really for everyone, because wandering doesn't simply mean being lost. It also means being free in a sense, right? That you can do whatever you want. If you're lost, going east is no different from going west. And so it's the freedom, the entitlement to do whatever you want. And that, I think, is what is at least one of the many things that attracts disbelievers to their way of life, to their way of thinking. And of course they'll say that, right? That they're free and that we're not tied to any religious commitment. In fact, the word religion, I've been told, or the origins of that word religion is related to the word for binding. So they think of religion as a kind of binding, and of course it is. But in any case, so they want wandering, but in order to get wandering, they have to exchange guidance for it. So it's the point that I've made before, is that this is a voluntary transaction that's entered into. And that's really important to remember, because otherwise we fall into the mistake of thinking that God is arbitrarily creating people who simply are blind and prone to wandering. They don't know what is true. They don't know what is right. They can't help themselves. This verse is saying, on the contrary, that they actually have guidance to begin with, and they sell it. They're sellouts because they didn't value it as much as they valued wandering. Guidance comes with a lot of responsibilities. Wandering comes with no responsibility whatsoever. So most people are going to make that trade. But as the verse tells us right away, not profited their commerce, and not were they guided ones. So this is not a profitable exchange. It's entered into with the hope of profit, but it's not profitable.